If you could travel through time, would one of your destinations be the medieval era? If so, you are in the right place, because in this journey, we will step into the world of medieval society in all its layers. From the wealthy nobles who resided in dark, cold castles to the lives of the most ordinary villagers, studying their everyday routines in detail, down to the very chambers where they slept. Historians generally refer to the Middle Ages as the period extending from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD brought about by the devastating onslaught of the Huns under Attila and the growing pressure of Germanic tribes up until the 1500s when the Renaissance began to flourish. The downfall of Rome shattered Europe's political and cultural unity, giving rise to a patchwork of small principalities. These minor states were plagued by weak central governments, declining systems of taxation, and severe reductions in population, largely the result of famine triggered by poorly organized agriculture. In addition, the continent lacked religious cohesion. Pagan groups and the spreading Christian faiths competed constantly to preserve and promote their beliefs. The political order, economic flow, and legal structure once guaranteed across Europe by the Roman Empire disintegrated, leaving the region dominated by barbarian tribes, fragmented mini-states, and impoverished communities. Along the coasts, pirates roamed unchecked, while inland regions suffered frequent attacks from raiders and bandits. Trade across the Mediterranean collapsed to its lowest levels. This early chapter of Europe's medieval story, defined by the absence of centralized cultural, religious, and economic authority, is known as the early Middle Ages. The focus of this book, however, will be on the High and Late Middle Ages, where we will look more closely at the lives of people from these times. Beginning in the 11th century, Christianity had firmly established itself as the dominant faith across Europe. Powerful kings gradually emerged from among the feudal lords, while alliances were slowly forged to resist the growing influence of Islamic civilizations in the East. Historians view this era as one of the most dynamic and complex in European history, an age rich with monarchs, noblemen, clergy, and superstitions. Meanwhile, the Islamic world had achieved an extraordinary degree of unity. As a result of this cohesion, Europe's trade connections with India and China were cut off. With complete control over both Mediterranean and Asian trade routes, Islamic societies shifted the center of global wealth and commerce to the Middle East and its surrounding regions. Europe's exclusion from these networks deepened its long-standing poverty. Economic activity was so limited that money itself began to lose value, since there was virtually nothing left to purchase. Paradoxically, this scarcity helped accelerate the rise of a new social structure. Kings began granting vast estates to influential elites in exchange for organizing agricultural production and supplying soldiers, a system that strengthened the authority of feudal lords, also known as seigneurs. These lords, in return, provided sustenance and protection to the people who lived on their lands. They employed them in the fields and trained them as soldiers when war required it. The majority of the population tied to a lord's estate, much like the land itself, was regarded as his property. This lowest social tier, possessing little in the way of personal belongings and treated as belonging to the lord, was made up of serfs. Serfs were not outright slaves, but they were far from free. They occupied a status somewhere between the two conditions. This institution of serfdom formed the backbone of medieval society. Serfs or peasants did not work for wages. Instead, they received basic necessities, shelter, clothing, and food in exchange for their labor. A fixed portion of the crops they grew was handed over to the local lord as tax, while the remainder they kept for their own survival. For medieval people, survival meant above all else securing enough food to avoid hunger. To go to bed with a full stomach was a far more pressing and important concern than earning coins or accumulating wealth. Equally important to the economic framework created by feudal lordships were the monasteries. As we will explore more closely later, Monasteries stood as pillars of the medieval economy, maintaining production networks just as vital as those of the lordship itself. Together with the castle, they formed the two primary centers around which medieval social life revolved. The castle, however, requires a careful distinction. While fortresses and castles shared similar architectural features, a fortress functioned mainly as a military stronghold, whereas a castle served the dual role of noble residence and protective strongpoint. This raises the question, what was life like within these castles, one of the central institutions of the feudal world? First, it must be remembered that the sweeping Viking raids of the 10th century forced feudal lords to accelerate castle construction. These efforts laid the foundation for Europe's architectural style in the centuries that followed. Castles were far more than aristocratic homes. They were indispensable defensive hubs, built to withstand invasions, as well as the endless skirmishes between rival nobles. Around these castles, essential services and institutions were deliberately positioned. Depending on the wealth and development of the region, the castle's surroundings might consist of scattered hamlets and villages, or, in more stable areas, gradually grow into towns and cities. Where urbanization took root, the immediate circle outside the castle walls was typically filled with guilds, craftsmen, and merchants. Beyond these inner rings, one would find the farmland, fields, and villages that fed the population. Where no towns emerged, the castle usually stood isolated amid broad agricultural estates and dispersed settlements. By the 13th century, Europe's population was no more than 60 million, and about 90% of those people lived in rural villages. This demographic reality highlights how much closer and more constant the ties were between nobles and peasants than between nobles and urban dwellers. At this stage of our exploration, we can turn to the daily life of the Peasant family, a wealthy noble household in central France during the 1200s, alongside the experiences of ordinary medieval folk. Within castles, the customs of domestic life might surprise modern readers. Lords and their wives typically slept in separate chambers, a practice that was not unique to the Middle Ages, but continued in many societies until as late as the 19th century. They only shared a bed when they intended to consummate relations. Such occasions were carefully prepared. The lord sent word ahead during the day, signaling his intention to visit his wife's chamber that evening. Upon receiving the message, the lady would cleanse herself, the chamber would be made ready, fires lit to warm the room, and attendants arranged just outside the door. These attendants supplied food, drink, and other necessities, all the while obliged to remain alert to their lord's every sound through the night. If the couple spent a passionate night together, they usually preferred to rest rather than wash afterward. For all their outward magnificence, life inside castles was far from comfortable. Servants rose before sunrise, tasked first with lighting dozens of fireplaces to push back the chill seeping from the stone walls and igniting oil torches to banish the gloom. This daily work left the interiors thick with the smell of smoke and burning oil. The servants themselves faced exhausting routines, endlessly climbing narrow and steep staircases to complete their duties. Moreover, in 13th century castles, glass windows as we know them had not yet been developed. Instead, all openings were sealed with wooden shutters, opened only in pleasant weather. The result was a dim, often smoky atmosphere that filled the castle's chambers with shadow and darkness. The lord's personal aide, literate, educated, and often well-presented young man who remained constantly at his side, was responsible for waking him, assisting him in dressing, and at the same time holding a chamber pot in the correct position so the lord could relieve himself comfortably. Although castles contained designated toilet areas, the immense size of the living quarters meant that chamber pots and other vessels for urination were kept in rooms and periodically emptied into cesspits by servants. These cesspits were generally situated outside the castle, though occasionally they were placed directly beneath it. One particularly notable incident from the 1000s records a castle meeting in which the cesspit beneath the main hall collapsed under the weight, causing dozens of participants to drown in the sewage below. Castle latrines were usually very simple in design. Wooden boards with a central hole positioned atop a raised stone platform, often hidden behind a small screen. The hole was typically directed outward, allowing waste to drop away from the walls. Another system involved digging a large pit beneath the hole. When the pit filled, servants would remove the waste in wheelbarrows and deposit it in another location. Such ground-level latrines were often found near the castle entrances, closer to the earth. A third approach employed a large barrel placed under a wooden hole. When it became full, attendants would replace it with a fresh barrel. This method, more practical and portable, was often located behind a curtain or in a small adjoining room in guest quarters. The odors from these facilities were unavoidable and considered a normal part of daily life. A single castle might house up to 20 separate toilet arrangements, though some had none at all, with inhabitants simply relieving themselves outdoors. Toilet paper did not yet exist. People used handfuls of dry grass, straw, moss, or, in the case of the wealthiest, discarded pieces of cloth. Using nothing at all was also common and not considered unusual. After waking, dressing, and attending to their personal needs, the lord and his family would gather in the dining hall, the first space they convened in at dawn. This hall held great significance, as it also served as the primary area for entertaining guests. Meals were arranged on a long wooden banquet table, often decorated with various cloths. Floors were generally bare, with carpets instead hung on walls. Decorations included documents of titles granted by the king, royal insignias and gifts, the family crest, banners, and religious icons and statues depicting Jesus and the apostles. Personal mementos from ancestors who had fought in wars, such as armor and weapons, were displayed alongside floral arrangements chosen by the lady of the house and tapestries or rugs she had woven with floral patterns. These halls were far simpler than the opulent residences of wealthy Romans or the extravagant palaces that would appear in later centuries, prioritizing practicality over ornate decoration. Breakfast for the lord's family typically consisted of white wine and white bread. The whiter the bread, the higher the grain content, and therefore the more prestigious and nourishing it was. Occasionally, olives or various meats might be added at the family's request, but the staple remained white wine and bread. Drinking water was avoided because clean, safe water sources were scarce, and consuming contaminated water could easily lead to illness. Wine, with a lower alcohol content than modern varieties, was therefore the preferred beverage. Following breakfast, family members went about their daily activities. The lady of the house and her daughters would first attend church for their devotions, and then return to the castle to spend time playing cards, a favorite pastime that provided some of the era's most enjoyable indoor hours. They typically occupied a large room on the highest floor of the castle, which offered the largest windows. Another common pursuit for noblewomen was needlework and embroidery, including sewing decorative fabrics, creating quilts, weaving carpets, and crafting elaborate garments. When cloth merchants arrived in the region, they were first summoned to the lord's castle, where the noblewomen would purchase the most valuable and high-quality fabrics. The arrival of these merchants was an eagerly anticipated occasion for the women of the castle. For noblewomen whose social activities were limited, the chance to select fine fabrics, which were otherwise difficult to obtain, was a genuinely pleasurable experience. Sewing for noblewomen was not merely a productive task, but also a form of education. During these times, they would converse on provocative topics, share gossip, assess potential suitors for the daughters of the household, and listen to the lady of the castle recount anecdotes related to religious teachings. The upbringing of noble daughters during this period had a singular aim: to prepare them for marriage to a suitable match, chosen by their fathers. Marriage was also a means of forging alliances between noble families, creating kinship ties. and thus girls were trained for matrimonial life from birth. Beyond demonstrating piety and skill in needlework, nothing else was expected of them. If, according to their family's priorities, they could play a few musical instruments and were literate, they were regarded as ideal candidates for marriage, which typically took place around the ages of 14 or 15. Yet, compared to women from lower social classes, noble girls experienced far stricter limitations and lived within a highly enclosed world. Another rare activity they might partake in was visiting wealthy relatives, a significant event in their lives. These visits, always accompanied by mothers and attendants, could last anywhere from a week to several months. Such occasions allowed the girls to socialize with cousins while providing their mothers the opportunity to observe potential suitors for their daughters and suitable brides for their sons. Noble girls were expected to maintain their virginity until marriage. A loss of virginity could lead to annulment, which might strain relationships between families, so childhood and youth were lived under constant supervision. There are records of virginity inspections before marriage, since the appearance of a former lover could be humiliating for a nobleman. A young girl who lost her virginity prior to marriage might, in some cases, be forgiven by her family and married off to a less prominent or older noble. In other instances, she would be confined to a monastery, severed from her previous social connections, and compelled to live a life of religious seclusion, cut off from men. Once in a monastery, girls took vows to renounce worldly pleasures, particularly sexual activity. Some forced into monastic life embraced their religious duties sincerely out of remorse, becoming true nuns, but in other cases, outcomes diverged from expectation. The strict religious enforcement and life entirely isolated from men could cause suppressed desires to emerge whenever the opportunity presented itself. A prime illustration of this phenomenon appears in Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, completed in 1351, written in the aftermath of the devastating 1348 plague in Europe. The Decameron portrays Florence during those dark days. The book consists of 100 stories told by 10 young people over the course of 10 days, with several stories depicting lustful and explicit sexual encounters, including those involving men in monasteries. From this medieval text, which has been preserved to the present day, it is evident that some women forcibly confined to monasteries did not hesitate to pursue relationships with peasant or urban men, abandoning religious principles when circumstances allowed. An illustrative tale from Boccaccio's Decameron unfolds as follows. Masetto of Lampole, pretending to be deaf and mute, gains entry to a convent of nuns under the guise of working as a gardener, and eventually becomes the shared lover of the sisters. Near Florence, there existed and still exists a convent famed for its beauty. Until relatively recently, it was home to 8 young nuns and an abbess. The convent had a capable gardener to tend to its flourishing garden, but one day this gardener decided his wages were insufficient, settled his accounts with the administrator, and returned to his hometown of Lampole. Upon his return, he was met by a strong young farmer named Masetto. Curious, Masetto asked the gardener, Nuto, about the responsibilities he had held at the convent. Nuto explained, "I worked in a beautiful, expansive garden. Occasionally, I would venture into the forest to gather wood, carry water, and perform similar tasks. But the nuns paid me so little that it wasn't even enough to buy a pair of shoes." He continued, "The girls, as if possessed by the devil, were fiery and restless. While I was working, one would insist, 'Plant the seedling here,' another would show a different spot, and yet another would snatch the shovel from my hand, instructing me to use it in a particular way. They were constantly interfering. Because of these reasons, I had no choice but to leave the job. The administrator asked me to recommend someone capable. May God grant him patience, for I don't know when or whom I will send." Hearing this, Masetto felt a sudden and intense desire to enter the convent. Although Nuto's description assured him that his goal was attainable, Masetto chose to keep his intentions secret. Nuto added, "It's fortunate that you've come. What can a man do among women? How would he manage? They often do not know their own minds." Motivated, Masato began to plan his approach to gain access to the nuns. Even though he was capable of performing the tasks Nuto had described, Masato feared that, because he was young and handsome, he might be rejected. He reasoned, "This place is remote. No one will follow me. I will pretend to be deaf-mute." One day, donning the clothes of a beggar and carrying an axe, he journeyed to the convent. By chance, the administrator happened to be in the garden at the time. Masato, feigning muteness, requested food from the official. In return for chopping wood, the administrator provided him with a meal. Demonstrating his skill and diligence, Masato chopped a large amount of wood that day. Impressed, the administrator supplied him with a donkey and took him to the forest for further work, keeping him for several days due to his exceptional performance. Eventually, Masato was introduced to the Mother Superior. The administrator explained, "This poor man is deaf-mute. He came here seeking alms, and I treated him well in exchange for significant work. He is strong, capable, and poses no threat to the young girls." The Mother Superior agreed, saying, "You are right. If he proves beneficial, keep him. Provide him with shoes, an apron, and ample food." Overhearing this conversation from a distance, Masato thought to himself, "If they appoint me gardener, I will tend this garden in a manner never before seen." The administrator, pleased with Masato's efforts, gestured to ask whether he wished to remain, and Masato nodded in agreement. Thus, he officially joined the convent, was assigned to garden duties, and shown his responsibilities. After several days of work, the nuns began to tease Masato, confident that he would not understand their words, and spoke to him in the crudest language. The Mother Superior, believing that if his tongue was incapacitated, so too were his other faculties, felt no concern. One nun remarked, "Do you never think about the fact that we live here confined and imprisoned?" Another replied, "Comfortably, as far as I'm concerned. No one hears me." The first continued, "I wonder, do you ever consider that, aside from the elderly administrator and this deaf man, there are no men here? I have heard from visiting women that all other worldly pleasures are nothing compared to the joy a man can give a woman. Since there is no one else, I want to test the truth of this saying with this deaf man. He is also perfectly suited, because he cannot reveal anything." The second nun protested, "What are you saying? Have you forgotten that we dedicated our virginity to God?" The first replied, "Ah, but how many things are dedicated to him daily, and yet not everyone keeps their vows. Surely we will find some who will honor their promise. And if we become pregnant, don't count your chickens before they hatch. We'll deal with that if it happens. There are countless remedies, as long as we don't reveal anything." Curiosity and desire grew in the second nun, who longed to experience a man for herself. She suggested, "It is nearly 9 o'clock. The other nuns must be asleep. Let us walk through the garden. Is anyone present? If not, we can take the man to the hut where he collects water. One of us will enter with him, while the other keeps watch outside. Since he is simple-minded, he will do exactly as we wish." Masato had been listening carefully to the nuns' conversation and waited patiently for them to make their move. After thoroughly surveying the garden to ensure that no one was present, the first nun approached him. She gently woke him and with tender gestures took his hand and led him to the hut. Masato, offering no resistance, complied with the nun's desires. Once the first nun had been satisfied, it was the second nun's turn, and Masato also fulfilled her wishes. Before leaving, both nuns tested Masato's abilities once more, indulging themselves further. They later recounted to each other that the pleasure they had experienced far exceeded anything they had previously imagined, describing it as 1,000 times greater than words could convey. From that point on, they sought Masato's company whenever they could. On one occasion, A nun who had an errand caught sight of this activity from a window and shared it with another nun. At first, they considered reporting it to the Mother Superior, but they ultimately abandoned that idea and instead became Maseto's accomplices. Eventually, the remaining 3 nuns each, on separate occasions, also experienced intimacy with Maseto. The Mother Superior, who only learned of these events last, eventually joined as well. One particularly hot day, while walking through the garden, the Mother Superior noticed Maseto sleeping under an almond tree, likely exhausted from his night's labors. The breeze had lifted his clothing, revealing his entire body. This sight awakened in her the same desire that had previously stirred the other nuns. She roused Maseto, brought him into her private chamber, and for several days indulged in the pleasures of love she had heard about but never experienced. Meanwhile, the other nuns grew restless and impatient. Finally, the Mother Superior sent Maseto back to his quarters, but continued to summon him frequently to satisfy her desires. Maseto soon realized that managing these complex affairs while maintaining his deaf-mute pretense was becoming increasingly difficult and could lead to serious consequences. One day, while lying in the Mother Superior's embrace, his tongue unexpectedly loosened, and he began to speak. He said, "I have heard that 1 rooster is sufficient for 10 hens, but 1 man is not enough for 9 women, nor even for a single woman would 9 men suffice. I can no longer endure this. This life has exhausted me to the point that I have no strength left for anything else." The Mother Superior was astonished and exclaimed, "What did you just say? I thought you were deaf-mute." Maseto explained, "I was, but not from birth. I became mute due to an illness. Tonight, my tongue has been freed." Believing his explanation, the Mother Superior then asked, "And what of the other 9 nuns with whom you have been intimate?" Maseto recounted everything truthfully. Upon hearing this, the Mother Superior understood that the young nuns were similar to herself in terms of chastity, but she wished to handle the situation carefully to prevent Maseto from leaving. A few days earlier, the administrator of the convent had also passed away. The nuns confessed everything to one another, and together they decided to create the appearance that Maseto, who had been long thought deaf-mute, had miraculously begun to speak through the power of their prayers and the intercession of their guardian angels. They then appointed him as the new administrator. Maseto continued his work in the convent as long as his strength allowed. Many of his children were born within the convent, but the Mother Superior kept the matter so secret that no one outside the convent ever heard of it. After the death of the Mother Superior, and in the final years of Maseto's life, he returned to his village, where he passed away peacefully. This story, taken from Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 1300s, illustrates just how unusual and intriguing situations could unfold in monasteries. Of course, not all girls entered convents for reasons like those described in this tale. Some young women chose to enter monasteries for educational purposes, motivated by their piety. The Church, concerned that unmarried women might otherwise lead lives of sin, often required that women who did not marry live in seclusion within convents. Additionally, girls from impoverished families sometimes opted for monastic life as a means of escaping poverty and avoiding the hardships of continuing life in a difficult social environment. It is also known that women deemed unattractive and thus unlikely to marry, as well as those who could no longer endure the demands of their husbands, often entered monasteries. The religious obligation for unmarried girls to join these institutions was so intense that some parents went so far as to write letters to the Pope, expressing their reluctance to send their daughters to convents. Many of these letters have survived to the present day. It is indisputable that women who were compelled to enter monasteries, apart from those who voluntarily sought education due to personal piety, experienced deep unhappiness. While churches functioned primarily as places of worship, monasteries were far more than that. They were religious institutions managing extensive lands, numerous churches, production facilities, and communities in various cities, essentially maintaining an entire infrastructure capable of self-sustenance. Monasteries adhered to widely recognized regulations alongside rules specific to their local circumstances. Certain principles, such as vows of abstinence, particularly regarding sexual activity for both men and women, were universally enforced across all monastic institutions. Another foundational rule was the vow of silence, which emphasized the avoidance of unnecessary speech. The reasoning behind this strict silence was the belief that excessive talking could lead to lies, and lies were thought to invite the devil and sin. While conversation was permitted at designated times of the day, overall, silence was expected to dominate. This practice of strict silence even led to the creation of a sign language within the Cluniac order to facilitate necessary communication without violating the vow. The Cluniac order, which originated in France in 910, took the vow of silence to an extreme, developing a sophisticated sign language to prevent monks and nuns from speaking excessively and thereby risking sin. It is important not to view this practice as limited to a single, isolated order. The Cluniac order grew into a vast network of 314 monasteries, stretching from Spain to Poland. For a time, this order shaped the social perception of Christianity across Europe. Members of the Cluniac order even ascended to the papacy. For instance, Pope Urban II, who became pope in 1088, was a member of this order and famously organized a crusade, excommunicating the Seljuk Turks for occupying Christian holy lands. Among the ancestors of the Dissim family, central to the narrative of our book, were the Hooks de Ur, who once held the position of abbess of the abbey's kitchen. In contrast to their sisters and commoners, the sons of the Lord enjoyed a far more vibrant and active lifestyle. As heirs to the family and essential to the continuation of the lineage, male children were regarded as the most valuable members of the household from birth. From an early age, they received both religious and military training. This military education initially took place alongside their fathers during hunting expeditions and later continued in the castles of other noble families, to whom they were sent for further instruction. It was customary for noble children to be sent to each other's households for education, enabling them to learn about different cultures, social customs, and diverse military techniques. This rigorous martial training was particularly critical for achieving the title of knight, as knighthood conferred both ecclesiastical support and a form of immunity in the eyes of the general populace. During their youth, young noblemen also formed friendships with the children of other noble families. Much of their time was spent drinking, socializing, and interacting with women in the company of these friends. To a peasant girl, the attention of a nobleman served as a validation of her own beauty, making these young noblemen comparable to modern-day celebrities. Engaging in brawls, and even causing death during these conflicts, was technically a crime punishable by death. However, as is still true in many societies, the law in the Middle Ages was often applied unevenly, predominantly targeting commoners rather than the elite. Noble children could usually evade consequences for their actions, since in a highly decentralized feudal system, few church or court authorities would dare punish the son of a powerful lord. Another highly enjoyable aspect of castle life was the frequent feasts. The Dissim family organized lavish entertainments in their castles, inviting respected knights and other nobles to participate. During these banquets, attendees gathered around a long table in the great hall, with the lord of the castle seated at the head on a slightly elevated and spacious chair. Guests were served meats, fish, and poultry luxury items sourced from distant regions, accompanied by fine wines. The banquet hall at Dissim Castle featured balconies on an upper floor, from which minstrels performed songs and recited poetry, providing entertainment throughout the evening. Theater performances and dances added to the enjoyment of the night. It is important to note that in those years, actors and bards did not hold the social status they do today. They were considered simple servants who were content to continue their lives on the wages provided by the Lord, proportional to how much pleasure their songs and performances brought to him. The most captivating moments of the evening often occurred when travelers from distant lands or knights returning from extended military campaigns recounted their experiences. In those times, most people had little understanding of the wider world. The majority of individuals rarely ventured beyond their immediate surroundings, and only the luckiest might ever see neighboring towns, let alone cities farther afield. Stories of distant lands were therefore largely known through the accounts of bards claiming to have traveled extensively, or knights who had participated in military expeditions. These narratives were frequently embellished, filled with extraordinary exaggerations. Sailors, for example, described encounters with mermaids and islands inhabited solely by dwarves. Consequently, for people living in the Middle Ages, the world beyond their immediate experience seemed populated by creatures that were half-human, half-horse, giants, ghosts, genies, and other terrifying beasts. Belief in these beings was universal, and for medieval people, it was not merely superstition. It was a reality that required no questioning. Occasionally, these feasts, which sometimes included the Lord's wife and daughters, featured performances by dwarfs as entertainers. Once the banquet concluded, and the Lord had become sufficiently inebriated, guests departed with his permission. The castle servants then tidied the now empty hall and found places to sleep, whether on the floor, on couches, or even on chairs, in preparation for the following day's duties. These castle staff comprised both slaves and serfs. Some serfs worked alongside their families within the castle. They had no private quarters and slept wherever space could be found in the hall, the kitchen, unused rooms, or even the dungeons. During the summer months, their workday often began at 5:30 in the morning and continued until 7 in the evening. They were afforded very few days off and received minimal compensation. Servants were given uniforms matching the colors of their lord's livery and received regular meals throughout the year. The leftovers from the lord's table often included foods unavailable in their home villages, making service in a castle a highly coveted position in that era. Another section of the castle consisted of the dungeons, which varied in location and construction. Some were rooms dug into the ground, others chambers at the top of towers, and occasionally they were positioned on the outer walls of the castle. In these dungeons, every condition was designed to maximize the discomfort of prisoners. There were separate areas for noble and common detainees. The lowest level dungeons, reserved for common prisoners, often lacked even a pot for human waste, forcing inmates to live in their own filth for months. Bathing facilities and fresh clothing were non-existent. Prisoners were required to remain in the garments they wore upon entering the dungeon. Sometimes straw beds were provided atop wooden frames, but many prisoners had no choice but to lie on bare stone floors, completely devoid of comfort. Conditions were slightly better for nobles. Though their dungeons may not have included privacy screens for sanitation, they were usually provided with pots that were emptied every few days. One reason for such harsh treatment was the difference in legal philosophy. In medieval Europe, a person accused of a crime was considered guilty until proven innocent, unlike modern law, which presumes innocence until guilt is established. Turning now to the daily lives of ordinary people, serfs, peasants, and townsfolk, their existence, while sometimes containing moments of beauty, was often filled with terrifyingly harsh realities that seem almost like fairy tales to modern readers. At the broadest level of the feudal hierarchy were the peasants, divided into two principal classes. The first group consisted of free peasants, who owned property, had the freedom to relocate, and could choose their own spouses. The second group comprised serfs, who could not leave the land they occupied, lived in homes assigned to them by their lord, and, while not technically slaves, were still bound to the land. Serfs made up roughly 80% of the peasant population, with free peasants accounting for the remaining 20%. Serfs were therefore neither fully free nor fully enslaved. They occupied an intermediate social class. Medieval society operated under a shared logic. Serfs and free peasants labored for the benefit of all. Knights fought on behalf of everyone, and clergymen prayed for the entire community, creating a societal structure in which each group had its role. Serfs lived in homes provided for each family and cultivated the fields allotted to them by the Lord. A significant portion of the harvest was paid to the Lord as a form of tax, while the remainder belonged to the serfs themselves. Any surplus produce could be sold in local markets. Lords, in turn, had certain responsibilities toward their subjects. They were obligated to provide basic necessities, including clothing and shelter, ensure protection from bandit attacks, and oversee the distribution of food during periods of famine. A lord did not have the authority to arbitrarily confiscate a serf's land, and in cases where such attempts were made, a serf had the right to take legal action. The amount of labor a serf owed to the lord on their allotted lands varied over time. For instance, in 13th century Poland, households were expected to provide only a few days of service per year. By the 14th century, this obligation increased to roughly 1 day per week per household, and by the 17th century, it had risen further to 4 days per week per household. This service extended beyond fieldwork to include various repair and maintenance tasks at the Lord's manor, construction and upkeep of roads, and gathering firewood. Both men and women of the household were obliged to contribute to these duties. Women, for example, were expected to spin wool and sew, producing several garments annually for the castle or local manor. Skilled craftsmen were also required to provide certain goods as part of their tax. Blacksmiths delivered armor, swords, or other tools of war, while carpenters supplied furniture requested by the lord. On days when serfs performed these services, they were often better fed and given more attention, a practice that reinforced the respect and authority commanded by the landowner. The reeve was the official responsible for managing the relationship between serfs and the lord, which included tasks such as collecting taxes and storing produce. Reeves often operated at the center of a network of bribery to accomplish their duties. For example, the valuation of taxes could be highly arbitrary. To determine whether a hen offered as tax was young and healthy, it might be required to jump from a certain height. Similarly, the vigor of a rooster provided as tax could be assessed by releasing it among hens and observing its sexual performance. The reeve also had the power to decide whether a serf's children could continue working the land after the death of a family member. To ensure that these demands were met and that taxes remained at an optimal level, people often offered small bribes, which became a primary source of the reeve's livelihood. Skillful balancing of bribery and tax collection was an essential aspect of the reeve's role. In terms of living standards, there was often little significant difference between serfs and free peasants. Serfs could accumulate property, grow wealthy, and even purchase their freedom, and historical records indicate that some serfs were actually wealthier than their free peasant neighbors. Nevertheless, free peasants enjoyed certain liberties that serfs did not. They could pursue any profession, relocate to different regions, and marry whom they chose, whereas serfs were restricted to professions, spouses, and locations approved by the lord within their feudal domain. Ordinary villagers generally had little need to track the calendar precisely, as their lives were dictated by the rhythms of the agricultural year. Knowing when to sow and when to harvest was far more important than the exact date. Examining domestic life in more detail, medieval French village houses were typically small and constructed of wood, sometimes consisting of a single room and occasionally containing multiple rooms. In colder and wetter regions, houses were often partially dug into the ground, featuring a small exit to the outside and only one window, designed to enclose and protect the inhabitants. In milder regions, wooden houses were built above ground, usually with 1 or 2 rooms. Adjacent to these homes, stables were often directly connected, allowing inhabitants to observe their animals from within the house. Animals frequently moved in and out, bringing their odors with them. Inside the house, a dining table would typically be covered with a linen cloth, accompanied by a few cupboards and simple furnishings. A central hearth provided warmth, while beds were wooden, stuffed with quilts and pillows made from animal feathers. Although these accommodations may appear rudimentary by modern standards, virtually no medieval village house was free from bedbugs and fleas. Knowledge of hygiene was extremely limited, and bathing was a true luxury. The medieval approach to cleanliness, which persisted over roughly a millennium, had roots stretching back to the Roman Empire. In Rome, public baths were not only important for hygiene, but also served as central hubs for daily social interaction and community life. As a result, the peoples of Europe had inherited a substantial cultural legacy from Rome, and were not entirely unacquainted with practices of cleanliness. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, daily life varied across regions, yet aspects such as family structures, legal systems, urban organization, and the influence of religion remained largely continuous. Of all these factors, religion, specifically the Church, exerted the greatest influence. The Church assumed a position of sole authority in many aspects of life, including cultural norms surrounding cleanliness. However, the Church's impact on hygiene during the medieval period was not entirely positive. While early Christians placed a clear emphasis on maintaining cleanliness, an ascetic philosophy that developed in the 3rd and 4th centuries gradually discouraged frequent bathing. Historical sources reveal that some saints even took pride in the dirt accumulated on their bodies. Saint Anthony, for example, reportedly never washed his feet, and Saint Jerome, a highly influential writer, argued that bathing was unnecessary, except for purposes of baptism. Inspired by such teachings, many devout Christians living in deserts or caves ceased bathing altogether. Refraining from washing was considered a demonstration of piety, and historical records list numerous individuals, particularly within the clergy, who apparently never bathed in their entire lives. Over time, this clerical approach influenced the wider population, contributing to a decline in visits to Roman-style public baths. Nonetheless, in the centuries that followed, some improvements in bathing practices became evident. For instance, in 1292, the city of Paris had 26 bathhouses, operated by guilds and serving roughly 200,000 residents. These establishments were open daily, except on feast days. By the 14th century, bathing culture had begun to re-establish itself gradually. Pietro de Crescenzi, in his work Liber Ruralium Commodorum, written in 1336, provided specific rules regarding bathing. He advised that individuals should neither engage in excessive sexual activity nor completely abstain from it prior to bathing. People should be hungry upon entering the bath, but if the bath proved too uncomfortable, they were allowed to consume 2 spoonfuls of dried grapes after thoroughly washing with water, mixed 1/3 with wine. He also recommended remaining in the bath for approximately 1 hour and bathing roughly every 15 days. Numerous other medieval European texts contain guidance on cleanliness and bathing, offering instructions on when and how to wash, the effects of bathing in different seasons, the importance of bathing before and after meals, and methods for washing during illness. Some texts even provided remedies tailored to specific conditions. For women prone to excessive sweating, one recommendation involved cleaning the body with cloths soaked in wine, containing ground wild blueberry leaves, or using the leaves themselves. Opinions on bathing varied widely. Certain clerics and medical practitioners believed that disease could enter the body through skin pores, and that bathing, by opening these pores, increased susceptibility to illness. Despite these debates, baths were in use, even if not universally present in homes. Most commonly, baths took the form of wooden tubs with the tops removed, though wealthier households possessed proper wooden bathtubs, often splintered at the bottom. Water was drawn from wells or nearby streams, using buckets, and heated on the hearth before being poured into the tub. The process of filling, bathing, and draining the water was labor-intensive, which sometimes led to couples bathing together or family members taking turns without changing the water. Nonetheless, the majority of people preferred a quicker cleansing using a basin of cold water. Because soap was scarce, people generally relied on soapwort or homemade soap, produced by mixing animal fats, such as pig fat, with ash. Given the effort involved, the luxury status of bathing, and the personal choice it entailed, it is accurate to conclude that medieval peasants bathed very infrequently. Although medieval Europeans are often criticized for poor hygiene, they did maintain certain basic practices. They routinely washed their hands and faces upon waking in the morning, and also before and after meals, largely because they did not use utensils. Personal hygiene became particularly important when interacting closely with others, and guides on proper etiquette were produced to assist diners, especially those lacking experience or imagination. One such manual, Less Continence is the Law Table, included rules such as, keep your fingers clean and nails well groomed. Once a morsel enters your mouth, do not return it to the plate. Do not touch your ears or nose with bare hands. It is expressly forbidden to bring the plate to your mouth when eating. Anyone wishing to drink must first finish what is in their mouth and wipe their lips. After the table is cleared, wash your hands before drinking. Clearly, hygiene concerns extended beyond bathing alone. Dental hygiene, however, was practically non-existent. The toothbrush was not invented until the 19th century, leaving medieval Europeans with very limited options for cleaning their teeth. At most, they removed food debris from between teeth using wooden splinters. Protecting teeth from decay was nearly impossible, which created a high demand for dentistry as a specialized profession, separate from barbering. Tooth extraction, the primary dental treatment, was an excruciating procedure. Unlike today, with numerous anesthetic options, patients had only two choices: endure persistent pain or lose the tooth. The simplest extraction method involved pliers with a central screw. The screw was turned into the decayed tooth, then tightened and pulled out. Since no natural remedy provided effective anesthesia, the patient had to endure extreme pain and often screamed throughout the procedure. Medieval Europe also faced the threat of syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease with a debated origin. Some researchers believe it was introduced to Europe by Christopher Columbus's sailors returning from the Americas, while others argue it traveled in the opposite direction, from Europe to America. The first documented outbreak occurred in 1494 to 1495 and was initially, and still often referred to, as the French disease because it spread during the French military occupation. Syphilis progressed in stages and could have horrifying effects. The nose might erode or swell grotesquely, altering facial and body structure, while parts of the skull could deteriorate and fall away. Effective treatment did not exist until 1910. Until then, to restore appearance, doctors would cauterize the damaged areas and insert prosthetics made from wood or marble to approximate a normal appearance. Turning to the penal system, it is important to discuss torture, which, while gruesome, served a functional role. However, torture was not a central feature of medieval justice. It was generally reserved for the most serious offenses, such as treason, heresy, or seducing a neighbor's wife. For most crimes, imprisonment or fines were the standard penalty, and the majority of medieval people never witnessed torture in their lifetime. In some cases, sentences were reduced if the accused confessed or showed repentance. Nevertheless, the period is notorious for its creatively cruel torture methods, which have contributed to the exaggerated perception that torture was common. One particularly horrifying device was the crocodile shears, essentially a large pair of pliers. What made it unique was that its jaws were shaped like a crocodile's head and lined with razors instead of teeth. creating a tool designed for extreme pain. One particularly gruesome device, modeled to the size of a real crocodile's mouth, was used against traitors and assassins of statesmen. Known as the crocodile shears, it was first heated until red-hot in a blazing fire, then applied to tear off the prisoner's penis, causing death from blood loss. Another horrifying instrument, called the pear of anguish, also referred to as the vaginal or rectal pear due to its shape, was used on women and men by inserting it into the vagina or anus. By turning screws, the pear could expand into 2 or 3 segments, inflicting unbearable internal pain. The breast ripper, or breast pincers, was employed both as a method of torture and as an interrogation tool, particularly in Germany and France, targeting witches and individuals accused of blasphemy. This device, which could be applied cold or heated in a fire, was designed to tear off the victim's breasts, creating a scene of true terror. The saw was another widely used torture method in Europe, notable for its accessibility, as almost every household possessed one. The accused was hung upside down with their hands tied and sawn through their legs. The inversion kept blood flowing to the head, ensuring the victim remained conscious and endured excruciating pain. This method was frequently applied to those accused of witchcraft, adultery, heresy, and rebellion. The scavenger's daughter, invented by William Skevington, forced the accused to crouch on their knees within a metal frame, which was then tightened until blood poured from the victim's nose and mouth. The Inquisition chair contained between 500 and 1,500 steel spikes designed to pierce deeply into the flesh, and in some cases, fire was placed beneath the chair to amplify the agony. The widow's tears involved inserting the victim's hand into a mechanical device with rotating cutting tools, causing the hand to be shredded. Blood from the victim then flowed from the eyes of a female figure on the front of the instrument, giving the device its ominous name. The head crusher consisted of a metal helmet fitted over the prisoner's head, gradually tightened by a crank to crush the skull, resulting in a slow, agonizing death. Many individuals, upon witnessing this device, would plead for mercy rather than resist, understanding that the goal of torture during that era was not purely pain, but eliciting confession and repentance. Whether guilty or innocent, the aim was to compel the accused to admit wrongdoing and display remorse. The two-headed stock was designed to drive prisoners insane while inflicting extreme physical suffering. 2 individuals were locked into the device side by side with their necks immobilized, forced to maintain eye contact all day. Any movement by one required the other to move in tandem. Prisoners in these stocks, kept in dungeon conditions, were left unshackled, but forced to remain in constant motion to maximize their suffering. Among the most creatively horrifying devices was the brazen bull, crafted entirely from solid brass and designed to the size of an actual bull. Victims were placed inside through a hatch in its belly, and a fire was lit beneath. The screams of the roasting victim were transformed by the device into a sound resembling the roar of a bull, while smoke exited through the bull's mouth, creating the terrifying illusion of an enraged animal. Originating in ancient Greece, the brazen bull is remembered as one of the most cruelly inventive torture devices in human history, a grim testament to the capacity for human cruelty. This, then, illustrates the darker side of the Middle Ages, a period often romanticized, yet in reality marked by immense suffering and brutality. Even this overview barely scratches the surface of the grim realities faced by many during this era. That concludes this segment of Living in the Middle Ages. For more stories that dive into the strange and mysterious corners of history, join me on the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.